Who's in the house? I've got a great stuff for you guys today. This is going to be fantastic today. I mean, it's always a Talmud-based show. We're always learning a page a day from the Talmud. But today's show is particularly Talmudic. We're actually going to do a Talmudic proof. We're going to follow the reasoning. We're going to get into the minds of the sages. It's going to be fantastic. How are we doing, everybody? How are we holding up? I just received a call shortly before going live today that a very, very holy guy and a pretty young guy is on a respirator in Montreal. So we're dedicating today's learning to Ari Ben Patti. Ari Ben Patti may have a complete and speedy recovery. Him and everybody who is sick right now, may everybody receive the healing that they need. And we say together, Amen. James Roth in the house. How are you, my holy brother? It's good to see you. Who else is in? What cities? What countries? If you're watching on replay, we want to know it also. It's great to see what a worldwide community we've got here at AT Daily. Our learning together is for sure adding to the healing of the world, a healing which is so necessary at this time, my holy brothers and sisters. Okay, Donna Smith in from Bahama, North Carolina. Elizabeth Hunt Lucarini from Luxembourg. Wonderful to have Luxembourg in the house. Iris from Vegas. Tracy from Oklahoma. How are you guys doing? Yehudit Sobel from Florence, South Carolina. We're going to go on a Talmudic journey today. We're going to go into the minds of the sages. We're going to see how they derive one of the laws that they derive. And at our end point today, or actually near our end point, we're going to find a unicorn, literally a unicorn in the Talmud. This is going to be a fantastic journey. So, where are we holding? We are Tractate Shabbos, second tractate of the Talmud. We're in chapter 2. Today, we're going to complete our discussion of the third Mishnah in chapter 2 and commence the fourth. So some Mishnahs have 10, 20 pages of discussion. Here we've got Mishnahs that have only one page. We had a new Mishnah yesterday. We have a new Mishnah today, and I believe we're going to have another new Mishnah tomorrow with God's help. So let's get into it. We learned yesterday in the Mishnah that the only kind of tent, right, the only material, we're talking about what can be used as a wick for a Shabbos lamp, and the only substance that comes from a tree that can be used as a wick is linen, right? Linen, which comes from flax. Flax doesn't sound like it's from a tree, but in yesterday's class, we derived that flax is considered a tree based on a verse in the book of Joshua. Also in this Mishnah, we learn that if a tent is made out of linen which is made out of flax, so that is the only type of tent that is made from a plant-based material that can become tameh, that can become ritually impure from covering a corpse. In other words, if there's a corpse in a tent, right, there's a dead body in a tent, a person died, let's say in their deathbed, there were people in the room, so everybody and everything in the room, even though they didn't touch the corpse, right, if you touch a corpse, so then you become ritually impure, but even if you didn't touch it, if you're in the same room with it, so everything in that room, everything that's sharing a ceiling, everything that's sharing the tent, as it were, acquires this ritual impurity, this tuma. But the tent itself does not become impure if, for example, it's made out of silk or if it's made out of cotton. But if the tent is made out of linen, which is made from flax, so then the tent itself becomes impure. Something that becomes impure from a corpse is going to be impure for 7 days, and there's going to be a procedure for going through a purification so that it becomes pure again. So we have this law that the only material of a tent, the only kind of material from which a tent can be made so that the tent itself acquires tumah from a corpse is linen. Very good. How do we know that the tent itself can acquire tumah from the corpse? From where is that derived, that a tent out of linen can acquire that tumah? So now we're going to go into this derivation, and we're going to have an exciting Talmudic journey, right? I mean, this is just not a law that most of us are going to need to understand where it comes from, why it's derived. But understanding the derivation is actually an exciting process in understanding how Talmudic thinking works. And I was actually reminded when I was in college, many of us, if we have any affinity for math at all, we'll remember the Pythagorean theorem, right? That in a right triangle, a triangle that has a 90-degree angle in it, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, right? The length of one side squared plus the length of another side squared equals the length of the hypotenuse squared. We all remember that formula, but how do you derive that formula? I know not everybody remembers, not everybody. Okay, but if you have a little bit of a memory for math, you'll probably remember a squared plus b squared. But how do we know that a squared plus b squared equals c squared? And I remember I was on the rowing team in college, and we were once at this facility training for actually a couple weeks preparing for a race. And we had a lot of spare time between practices. And someone said, do you remember how you derive a squared plus b squared? And nobody remembered the derivation from geometry class. And so we challenged ourselves to figure out how we derive a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And I'm certainly not going to do a geometric proof with you right now, but I did make this figure. And so for those who are mathematically minded, this is how you derive a squared plus b squared equals c squared. You start with that figure, and then you can work your way over to it. And it was exciting for us to come up with that derivation. So today we're going to derive how we know that a linen tent can acquire tumah, ritual impurity, from a corpse. Okay, so the word tent in Hebrew, ohel, is used in the law of the corpse and how a corpse can transmit impurity. And it is also used in the description of the tabernacle in the desert. And that's what we've been reading about for the last few Torah portions. First, the design of it, then that it was built, and then just recently it's been inaugurated, and Moses put it together, and now in this week's Torah portion, he is anointing the priests so that they can begin their service in the tabernacle. So the tabernacle was the original temple in the desert. It would eventually be replaced by Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. But we use the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the portable temple, right? The tabernacle was portable. That's the whole idea. We were wandering in the desert for 40 years, and the tabernacle was portable. When we would camp in a spot, the first thing that would happen is that the Levites would erect the tabernacle from all of its component parts, right? And so there's the Ark of the Covenant is in there, and there's curtains surrounding it, and there's an altar, and there's the menorah, and all these different pieces of it, and there is a cover over it, right? There is a tent over the tabernacle. The tabernacle is a tent, basically, but it's a tent because it has a covering. And it has an inner covering and an outer covering. So the inner covering is a tent made of flax linen. So that's how we know that a tent, for something to be a tent, it has to be made of linen, right? To be technically a tent in the Torah, it has to be made of flax linen. But the outer covering, that is made out of animal hides. And that eventually is going to take us to our discussion of the unicorn. It's going to be very exciting. So we'll get to the outer covering in a moment. But the inner covering made out of linen. Because the word tent in Hebrew ohel is repeated several times in the passages describing how the Mishkan, how the tabernacle in the desert is put together. Our sages will expand that in order to be considered a tent, it does not have to be exactly like the tent in the desert. It doesn't have to be that big. The material itself doesn't have to be spun in exactly the same way. It doesn't have to be a 6-ply thread. It doesn't have to be spun in this direction. It doesn't have to be folded this many times. But they won't go so far as to say that each use of the word tent as an amplification, right, to include things that are similar but not exactly the same. But they will not go so far as to say that it includes a tent made from other materials, right? Not cotton, not silk. It has to be made out of linen. And remember, this is a technical derivation. Of course, you can see a tent made out of that other material, and we would call it a tent. But for these purposes, to derive laws, then we have to understand that what is technically a tent, and therefore is going to have certain qualities, stringencies associated with it, needs to be made out of linen. Now, the fact that the Mishkan was also covered with the ram skin and tachash skins, these animal hides made of ram and an animal called a tachash, which we're going to get to a little bit later. From that, we are going to derive that also a tent made of animal hides can become tameh, can receive ritual impurity from a corpse. But right now we're talking about linen, right? Okay. I'm sorry. So that's how we make the connection, right? That's how we make the connection because the word tent is used in the Mishkan and it's used for corpse tuma. So that's how we know that a tent can receive corpse tuma and what it has to be to qualify as a tent. Either made of linen, like the inner covering over the tabernacle, or made of animal hide, like the outer covering. Now, the ram and the tachash are both kosher animals, right? We're told that they're both kosher animals. A ram, we know that a sheep is a kosher animal. The definition of a kosher animal, meaning because fowl is kosher too, but here we're talking about a mammal, right? So for a mammal, to meat, in other words, right? For it to be kosher, like a cow or a goat or a sheep, and there are some other types of animals that qualify also, and I'm not going to go into the rules of kashrut now, but basically it has to have a certain kind of hoof, and it has to chew its cud, and it has to qualify under certain characteristics. A ram is definitely a kosher animal. What about the tachash? How do we know that's a kosher animal? So we're going to learn here that it must be a kosher animal because we have a tradition that only a kosher animal is fit for use in the heavenly service. But before we get there, what we're trying to ask is, okay, so we know that a tent made of animal hides can acquire tuma from a corpse, can become ritually impure from a corpse, not by just touching it, but just by being a roof over that corpse. Now, even though we know that we cannot use the skin of a non-kosher animal in the heavenly service, right? So we wouldn't use the hide of such an animal in the tabernacle or in certain other cases. But if we have a tent just for the purpose of living in it, you can live in a tent made of animal hides, and it doesn't have to be kosher animals for you to live in it. It can only be a kosher animal if we're going to use it in the heavenly service, right, in the temple. If you have a tent made of the hides of a non-kosher animal, so can that tent acquire impurity from the corpse if it's made of a non-kosher animal? So Rava teaches that the answer is yes, a non-kosher animal, a tent made from the hides of non-kosher animals can acquire impurity from the corpse in the same way as a tent made from kosher animal hides. How do we know that? So Rava says we learn that out from the law of tsaros, right? That's biblical leprosy, as we discussed yesterday, not modern leprosy. This is ancient leprosy, doesn't exist anymore. It's at, the nation has to be living at a very high spiritual level for us to suffer from the spiritual malady, which presents as a physical manifestation of tsaros, biblical leprosy. And biblical leprosy, when we learn it out, it says that biblical leprosy can appear in a garment, right? We learned yesterday it can appear on your skin, on a person's skin, or on their clothing, or on their house, right? So it can appear on clothing. And what kind of clothing? Clothing that is, they say a few different kinds of clothing, what it's made out of, and the list of the different things that the clothing can be made out of. And let me just have it in front of me. Rava says that, so that the tsaros, the biblical leprosy, can appear either in the warp or in the woof. So those are the threads that are going to become the fabric, but it hasn't even been woven together yet. Whether they be of linen or of wool, or in a hide, or in anything made of a hide, right? So if you're like Tarzan and you have clothing made from animal skins, so that is subject to biblical leprosy. It can become leprous. Now, because it says, or in a hide, as part of that list, it could have said, whether that clothing is made from linen or wool or hide or something from a hide. But because it says, or in a hide, rather than or hide, right? There's an extra preposition. There's an extra use of in a. So because it says, or in a hide, and that was unnecessary, so there our sages have a little bit of room to step in and interpret what the Torah meant by the extra and unnecessary use of that preposition. And Rava, the sage Rava, steps in and says, from that we learn that it can attach, that impurity, ritual impurity, can attach to either the hide made from a kosher animal or from a non-kosher animal, a kosher animal or a non-kosher animal. And therefore, since in the case of the materials that in clothing, or since the fabrics, whether they're made of hide or linen or wool, that can acquire tsaros, we learn out that also it applies to the tent, right? That a tent can acquire tumah from the corpse if that tent is made out of linen or wool or the hide of an animal, whether it's a kosher animal or a non-kosher animal. The Gemara objects, meaning later sages object and say, but how can we learn from the law of tsaros, of biblical leprosy, this principle and attach it to the case of the tent over the corpse? We can't, the analogy doesn't work. Why? Because in the case of tsaros, that law is more stringent. Tsaros can attach even to the threads before they're woven. In the case of linen and wool, as soon as the thread is created, as soon as it's spun, tsaros can appear in the threads, and then it would disqualify those threads become impure, right? But in the case of corpse tumah, corpse impurity, it can't affect things that are still a thread, only a fabric that's already been woven. Since the law of tsaros is more stringent than the law of corpse tumah in terms of what that tumah, what that impurity can attach to, it's more stringent, and therefore we shouldn't derive that the corpse can impart tumah on the tent in the same way. So now we don't have a source for saying that the hide, that the tent made of animal hide of the non-kosher animal as well as the kosher animal can attract that impurity from the corpse. So we look for another place to derive that the hide from a non-kosher animal can also acquire the corpse impurity. Now we look to the law of creeping things, the sharets, right? So a creeping thing, a cockroach, certain kinds of insects, scorpions, all kinds of creeping things impart a kind of impurity that doesn't belong on a sacrifice or a person who's going into the temple. That's what tuma is, right? Tuma is a ritual impurity, which if you have it, you can't bring a sacrifice. If the sacrifice has it, it can't be brought. There's all kinds of conditions under which this impurity matters. Creeping things create that impurity, and in the list of items which the creeping thing can impart impurity on, we have linen and wool and hides. And hides is mentioned in a way, again, where in that list there's extra verbiage, and so we can learn out that the tuma of creeping things can be imparted to hides of both kosher animals and non-kosher animals. So therefore, now we can extend that law also to the tent acquiring tuma from the corpse. But the Gemara objects again. The law of the sharetz, of creeping things, also has a stringency which corpse tuma doesn't have, right? So we're talking about comparing sharetz tuma, impurity imparted by a creeping thing, to corpse tuma, the ritual impurity imparted by the corpse. And a creeping thing, you only need a creeping thing as big as a lentil, like a baby cockroach, right, which is only as big as a lentil, can impart the impurity, the ritual impurity of creeping things onto, let's say, clothing, right? Maybe made from an animal hide. But corpse tuma, the piece of the corpse, like let's say a corpse was buried, and then later some bones were found, and so you have pieces of bones, and they're going to impart the tuma. So they have to be, the piece of the corpse has to be as large as an olive bulk, right? A creeping thing imparts tuma, even if as little as a lentil, the size of a lentil, but for a corpse, you need a piece as large as an olive. So therefore, the tuma of creeping things is more stringent than the tuma of a corpse, and we can't derive the law of the corpse from the law of the sharetz. But since in both cases, the case of tuma being imparted by biblical leprosy, and in the case of tuma being imparted by the creeping thing, in both cases there were amplifications in the list of items that can receive that kind of ritual impurity, and in both times the lists were amplified by our sages to include both the hides of kosher animals and non-kosher animals. It seems that we've established a general principle that with respect to contracting tuma, with respect to contracting ritual impurity, the hides of kosher animals are treated the same way as the hides of non-kosher animals, and therefore we can extend this principle to the law that we're talking about here, a tent made of animal hides over a corpse. Whether those hides come from a kosher animal or a non-kosher animal, that tent can receive tuma from the corpse. While we're talking about the hides of kosher animals, so we ask, how do we know that the tachash, which is mentioned in the Torah, right, there were these tachash skins. And everyone's like, what's a tachash, right? In the tabernacle in the desert, the tabernacle that was designed by, according to Moses, God designed it. He gave Moses the instructions. Moses passed those instructions to Betzalel, and Betzalel, with his helper, Aholiab, supervised the construction of the tabernacle in the desert. And there were many, very, very, very specific instructions about how it was built. And acacia wood was used for the beams, and there was gold and silver and copper, and there was sockets and rings, and the materials themselves were made of scarlet thread and sky blue thread, etc., 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 etc. But the outermost covering was made of animal hides, and there were two animals used for that covering of hides. One was the ram, so the male sheep, and the other is the tachash. What is a tachash? we don't see any of them in our world. Our sages didn't know either. So they were trying to figure out, well, what is a tachash? So that they were able to use the tachash skins to cover the tabernacle in the desert. And how do we know that the tachash was a kosher animal? Well, we have a principle that only kosher animals and the parts of kosher animals can be used in the heavenly service. And we learn that out from tefillin. So here's my tefillin bag. And you've seen me wearing tefillin on some of our live music shows when we have a musical hallel. And so this is tefillin. And this is from the command that we have in the Shema, that you will take these words, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your resources, etc., 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 and you shall bind these words as a sign upon your hand, and they shall be a symbol before your eyes. That's what it says in the Torah, and it does not say, well, how do you bind it? How do you bind these words as a sign on your hand? And how shall these words be a symbol before your eyes? And so we have a tradition that what tefillin is, right, and what it's made out of, right? And so So what is tefillin? It's this long black leather strap, right? I'm not going to put it on right now, but I would put the box here and the arm tefillin. I would put it next to my left bicep, so that when my arm is down, it would be next to my heart. And here, I'm just going to open this up. So this is the cover that we just used to protect it. And then there's another protective cap right here. And then this is tefillin. And inside this box, there are certain passages from the Torah, specifically what I'm talking about right now. The command that you shall bind these words as a sign upon your hand, as symbol before your eyes, etc. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul. There's 4 passages here, and then there's also the head tefillin. So the passages are all in one scroll inside the arm tefillin. This is the head tefillin. Take off the outer covering, and you can see that it's divided into 4 pieces. 4 compartments are inside, and those 4 passages are in there. The point here is that what tefillin is and how to make it and how to wear it is not spelled out in the Torah, and our sages didn't derive it from the Torah. What tefillin is and what it originally looked like and how to make it was taught to Moses by God at Mount Sinai. So there are some laws that are part of the oral Torah, but they're part of the Torah. They're absolutely binding commandments. They're not in the written Torah, but they are the core of the Torah Shel Peh, the oral Torah, the Torah of the mouth, right? And so this was a halacha, a law that was taught by God to Moses at Sinai, what tefillin is. Of course, there are many, 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 many technical requirements of how to make tefillin, and those are spelled out in other places in the Talmud and in other sources as well. But the original commandment to make tefillin, and it's made, it looks like it's sort of manufactured, but it's made from animal hide. This is pressed cow hide, and you can see on the bottom, and it's sewed that it's sewed together, and that's made with the sinew of a cow. Okay, and what tefillin is and how to make it was taught to Moses at Sinai. So that's one of those laws that was originally given to Moses at Sinai, as opposed to many other laws that are in the Talmud that our sages derive from more general laws in the Torah, where we needed more specificity in order to know how to obey them, how to fulfill those obligations. But how to fulfill the command to bind this as a sign upon your hand was taught to Moses at Sinai. That's where tefillin originally comes from. And he was also taught that it had to be made from the hide of a kosher animal. You can't make it from a horse. You got to make it from a kosher animal. And it's typically made from a cow. All right. Let me move that over there. Okay, so from the principle of tefillin, we know that an animal whose skin was used on the tabernacle, which is like the holiest service of all, would have to be a kosher animal. So whatever the tachash was, right, it would have to have been a kosher animal. But our sages were curious and they were trying to figure out, well, can we determine anything more about the tachash than the fact that it was kosher? For example, was it domesticated was it a domesticated animal or an undomesticated animal? And of course, they searched throughout Scripture and throughout the tradition, trying to figure out more about what the tachash really is. And so Rabbi Ella, in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, in the name of Rabbi Meir, said that the tachash, it no longer exists, right? It was a creature that only existed in the time of Moses. It was a one-off creature. It's like it was a creature that was brought by God so that it would be available so that its skin could be used to cover the tabernacle. And the animal didn't really exist before and hasn't existed since. It was a one-off creature, according to Rabbi Ella, in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, in the name of Rabbi Meir. That creature had one horn. One horn. A unicorn. Isn't that great? I'm not sure, unicorns, we see them in cartoons and they usually look like a horse but brightly colored and with the one horn coming out right here. And I don't know where that tradition in the modern culture comes from. I'd like to know more about that, but for all we know, it comes from the Talmud, right? And it's the tachash mentioned in the Torah that according to our sages, it was a creature that only existed in the time of Moses. It had one horn, and its skin was multicolored, right? It was a very beautiful animal. It was unusual. It kind of, I imagine it having a kind of iridescent quality to its skin, but it was definitely multicolored. And in terms of the question, was it a domesticated animal or an undomesticated animal? Unknowable, because it only existed at that time. Our sages conclude we don't know whether it was a domesticated or undomesticated animal. Now, some commentators, more recent than our sages of 2,000 years ago, have offered the interpretation that perhaps the tachash was a narwhal. Okay, a narwhal is a creature of the sea. It's sometimes called the sea unicorn. They do still exist. You can see them typically in cold waters of the northern Atlantic, I think in the Baltic Sea. That's where you're more likely to find a narwhal. And they have one horn. It's actually a tooth. One of their teeth is overgrown. And you can almost imagine sort of like a walrus, but instead of one of the teeth going down, it goes out, and it can be quite long. I mean, it can be as much, I think, as like 15 feet long, the narwhal tusk. And it's spiral. It has a beautiful spiral shape. And so these people say, yeah, and the narwhal, for some reason it just swam down and washed up on the shore of the Red Sea. And that's how the children of Israel had access to it in the desert. Listen, the children of Israel were in the desert because 10 miracles were performed for us as we left Egypt in the form of the 10 plagues. And then the sea was parted, and then God himself appeared at Mount Sinai. So, once you accept all those miracles happen, then of course you can accept that there was a one-off creature that only existed at that time to provide its skin, its hide, for use in the tabernacle. And other people suggest that it may have been the giraffe whose skin was used. But, really, why are we looking for a practical explanation for something that obviously, has a miraculous aspect to it? And so there we go. But according to Rabbi Meir, brought down by Shimon ben Lakish, brought down by Rabbi Ella, the creature was one-off in the time of Moses, had a single horn, and a multicolored skin. With that, we conclude our discussion of the third Mishnah in chapter 2 of Tractate Shabbos. And that brings us to the fourth Mishnah, which is also on this page, page 28. And we'll just introduce that Mishnah. We'll discuss that Mishnah tomorrow. But to introduce the Mishnah, it's that we're back to with what may we light the Shabbos lamp. So we can make a wick from a garment, right? From a garment. If it's a tree product, right, it can only be linen. But there's other cloths that can be used for the wick in a Shabbos lamp as long as it burns steadily. So one thing that you might have done, right, is like you had an old garment, and so maybe now you'll cut some cloth from it to use as a wick. And indeed, in terms of the vestments of the priests in the temple, priests were serving in the tabernacle and later in the temple, and eventually their clothing would wear out. Now that was holy clothing. It was used in the service, a priest's service in the temple. So you can't just take that clothing, and use it like rags to wipe down your kitchen. That rag has holiness to it. You need it to burn it. But one thing you could do with it is use it in a wick in the temple candelabra, and likewise in the temple menorah. And likewise, for your Shabbos lamp, you can take strips from a garment. But if you make a wick from a strip that was a piece of a garment, Rabbi Eliezer says that it must be singed before it can be used. You have to light the wick and then put it out before Shabbat begins, and then it will be prepared for Shabbos. Rabbi Akiva says that is not necessary. You don't have to singe it first before Shabbat begins, and the law follows Rabbi Akiva. But what I did not know until this week, because I read it in Chayenu, the weekly publication of Chabad, is that there's a custom that who lights the candles in a family home? The mom, right? It's the mother's duty to light the candles in a family home for Shabbat. But there's a custom that the father in the family, the husband, can assist in that mitzvah. What does the father do? He prepares the candles, right? So he puts fresh candles in the candle holders, or if people use oil lamps, he puts oil in the lamps and gets everything ready for mom to come over and light it. And what he also does to finish the preparation so that it's ready for mom to light the candles is he singes the wicks. He lights the wick and then he blows it out. Why? Because then when mom comes and lights it, it's fully ready for her. It'll catch quickly. There won't be, especially when you talk about an oil lamp, you want to make sure that the oil is rising up into it. There's enough oil there. There's not, some problem that the oil didn't get there evenly, etc. By lighting it, make sure that it burns well, and then put it out. You can do that before Shabbat begins. Now the candles or the oil lamp are ready for mom and the daughters, let's say, to come along and do the candle lighting. So men can participate in candle lighting by preparing the candles or the oil lamps for their wives, and lighting them and then blowing it out so that the wick is fully prepared. And that's a custom even today. I was not aware of it, but I plan to, if I remember, God please help me remember, to do that tomorrow to help Nina get ready for Shabbos. That is what I have today. I'll give you a chance, if you have questions, you can put them in the comments, and I'm going to scroll over to that so that I can see it. And just so you have time in case you're going to add questions there, let's just pray together, my friends. We dedicated today's learning to a rabbi in Montreal, Canada. His name is Ari Ben Patti. He's on a ventilator, and we're praying, please, God, in the merit of the learning that we've done today, please grant a complete and speedy recovery, a refuah shlema to Ari Ben Patti. And we also ask for a complete healing of everybody who is suffering from COVID-19 and for all illnesses, for everybody in our community and the loved ones of our community. May everybody receive the healing that they need. And we say, and including who I mentioned yesterday, Rabbi Chaim Ben Leah in Jerusalem, founder of Breslov Research Institute. We're really praying for him. And everybody who's got the disease, please God, may they receive the healing that they need, the treatment that they need, and the full recovery. And let's say Amen. So let me just check if there are any questions here. Frona Adelson says, the minutiae in the Talmud is overwhelming. There is a rule for everything. Yes, there is. And, like sometimes it's really hard. Like, how deep do I need to go to understand this law that's just, it's unlikely to ever apply in my life, that I'm going to be in a tent with a corpse, right? And wondering whether the tent itself acquired impurity. But when we dive into such a law to understand how the sages derived, it sharpens the mind incredibly to follow the analogy to the analogy, the Gezerah Shava, which is a form of interpretation where, because there's a word here, tent is mentioned in the impurity from a corpse, and tent is mentioned in getting leprosy, biblical leprosy that attaches to that fabric, or because a creeping thing enters into such a place. So then we can make that transfer of information. And understanding that really helps one be able to analyze very practical problems in the world, right? And that's why people who study Talmud often do very well in law school, because they've already been engaging in that kind of thinking. But even in just practical, mundane matters, when you have a problem to solve, the ability to break down the problem into its component parts, to compare where each of these parts of the problem has been seen before and where you've seen a solution, and then asking, will it apply now? It's the same kind of thinking that medical researchers are going through right now, trying to figure out, well, which drugs will work to treat symptoms of COVID, which drugs will work to create a vaccine, etc. Sharpening the mind, it's so important. Okay. Ooh, there were a lot of comments. Leona Sue Thacker says, if we make the wick from a garment, should it be twisted or braided? We're going to get into that tomorrow. Definitely the question, that's what the conflict between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva is all about. Is if you take that strip of the garment, what do we do with it in order to make it a wick? And there's going to be conditions, and we're going to discuss that tomorrow. So we'll wait for that tomorrow. And awesome. That's what I've got for us today. Thank you for going on this journey of Talmudic reasoning and logic with me today. It's not easy. It took me a little while to break it down, so I was prepared, and I hope I've done it justice. I know I didn't do it enough justice, but I did my best. So, my dear friends, sending you big love from LA, and with God's help, we'll see you tomorrow. Tomorrow's Friday. We'll be getting ready for Shabbos. Oh, and let me mention, if you're still with me, on Monday, Nina and I are going to do a show at noon Pacific. We'll be sending out a notice, helping people to make your Seder fun and meaningful. So we're going to have a show just on the subject of making a Seder fun and meaningful, even if you're forced to have your Seder alone, something that normally never happens. But this year, there are a lot of people who are going to be having Seders, just two people or just one person. And we're going to be talking about how to make any Seder fun and meaningful. Watch for that live show from Nina and me on Monday. Take care, my holy brothers and sisters.